Ukraine and Russia have been bound together for centuries. The original Russian state, called Kievan Rus, many hundreds of years ago was based out of Kiev. And in the subsequent centuries, Kiev and Moscow, Ukraine and Russia, have been very close together. First, during the period of the Tsarist Empire, and then after that, in the last century, as constituent elements of the Soviet Union. As the two biggest republics, most populous republics in the Soviet Union, which consisted of 15 republics, Russia and Ukraine often provided the direction, provided the leadership, most of the scientific cadre of the Soviet Union during that period. In 1991, the Soviet Union split apart. The Soviet Union stood for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and those republics were 15. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, they all became independent states. So Russia was an independent state, Ukraine was an independent state, and 13 other states on the periphery of Russia or bordering Russia became independent states. In the last 20 some odd years, you have, for the first time in our memory at least, Russia and Ukraine existing as independent sovereign states. Crimea is a peninsula in the Black Sea. Since the independence of Ukraine in 1991, it's been part of the state of Ukraine. However, prior to 1954, it was considered part of the Russian Republic. And in 1954, then General Secretary of the Communist Party, Khrushchev, assigned or transferred Crimea to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, Soviet Socialist Republic. I mean, Ukraine is a country that speaks partly Ukrainian and partly Russian. And the Crimean Peninsula has a majority of Russian speakers and close ties to Russia, not least of all because the Russians have a main naval base on the Crimean Peninsula at Sevastopol. Now, they agreed with the Ukrainian government to a long-term lease of that territory on the Crimean Peninsula for the Russian Black Sea Fleet. So you have Russian military, the Navy, on that peninsula. So Crimea, since the independence of Ukraine and of Russia, has been a bit of a problematic area. There have been times back and forth where the local parliament has suggested they would have a referendum to be independent themselves of Ukraine, or as we see in the most recent times, to actually become part of Russia. The European Union was negotiating an agreement that would open up trade and business with Ukraine a little more with the Europeans. And in return, Ukraine had to agree to do certain things to make their economy more oriented towards Europe. Again, Russia is very suspicious, very concerned about what they see as this forward march of Europe into what was the former Soviet in space. So they, Russia, offered the Ukrainians different terms. President Yanukovych and his government chose not to sign an agreement with the European Union, but rather to cooperate more closely economically with Russia. And those people in Ukraine who believe that the future of the country is better oriented towards Europe and that best thing they could do would be to join European institutions were upset. They disagreed with what the government did. They thought there was some sort of political arrangements that they weren't fully aware of, so they protested. They went to the streets and protested. In November, December, increasing numbers of people took to the streets. They became more demanding. The government chose to try and control them or push them out of the streets. There were clashes. There was violence. Many dozens of people were killed in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. And President Yanukovych and his government didn't feel they could safely stay in Kiev because of the level of demonstrations and the potential for violent overthrow. So the president left the capital. He was the last person actually elected to be president of Ukraine, and in fact, Russia says he is the legitimate president of Ukraine. However, he's in Russia. After he left, the Ukrainian parliament formed a new government with an acting president and an acting prime minister, and they will at some point in the near future, hold some elections and elect a new president. Russia has said they don't recognize the interim government. They don't recognize the process. They don't recognize the individuals. They don't believe it's representative of all of Ukraine. In Crimea, where Russia took steps to make sure the naval base was secure, and we had many, many armed troops who were, to be fair, in uniforms that aren't marked with insignia, so you can't say definitively where they're from and what their loyalty is, but in any case, they've secured Russian naval bases in the peninsula more broadly. And Crimea has taken a referendum and voted with what is reportedly around 98% of the vote to become part of Russia. Since the vote, President Putin has said, yes, they will be part of Russia, and the Russian Duma or parliament will vote to ratify this. The Europeans in the U.S. have said, no, we don't recognize the legitimacy of this referendum. This is not proper, it's not right, and they won't recognize Crimea being part of Russia. We certainly believe this was not a legitimate way for Crimea to express some political desires. We believe it should have been done within the Constitution of Ukraine in consultation with Ukrainian officials, not as a sort of a bloc that separated off with the support of the Russians. It's controlled by armed troops. Whether that's an occupation, an invasion, it's a bit semantic on how you call it because we can't prove definitively whose troops they are, but Russia's certainly supporting it and it works to their favor. And we see that Europeans and the U.S. have responded by putting economic sanctions against some Russian officials and some Crimean officials. So the response so far from the U.S. and the West has been to respond in economic, financial terms rather than in military terms. Now, the fact is, on the ground, the military controls Crimea, and that won't be challenged in the near term. It's an international crisis, certainly, a diplomatic and political crisis. The highest level leaders of the U.S. and the West engaged in this, commenting on this, trying to somehow respond to this in political and economic terms. In regional terms, it's probably as confrontational as things have been since the end of the Cold War. Much of the Cold War was a standoff between the nuclear forces in the NATO-US side and the Warsaw Pact Soviet Union side. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, of the 15 republics that became independent, 4 of them on their territory had nuclear weapons. Russia had the biggest or the greatest amount of the nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union. But in addition, there were facilities, hardware in Kazakhstan, in Ukraine, and in Belarus. Now, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, all 3 agreed that they would give up their nuclear weapons and facilities. They would either go back to Russia or they would destroy them, but that they would become non-nuclear states. Now, as part of that agreement, the United States and Russia agreed that in return for Ukraine giving up their nuclear weapons, they would support their territorial sovereignty. The Ukrainians feel that they were guaranteed some support in this treaty to support their territorial sovereignty, and now Russia is certainly directly violating it, and the U.S. and allies are doing nothing to support it. But treaties very rarely say, and we will do that by doing A, B, C, and D, including using military power. So at the diplomatic level, they're trying to work out what exactly does support mean, how do we do it effectively. In economic terms, the most significant connections between Russia and Europe are in the area of oil and gas. Russia has the world's largest gas reserves, certainly in the first or second in oil reserves. And there are many pipelines that go to the west, several of them through Ukraine, and they supply oil, but particularly natural gas, to European countries. Now, these pipelines have proved problematic in the past when Ukraine and Russia have had political disputes. Russia has turned off the flow of gas to Ukraine, and Ukraine subsequently turned off the pipes that go through Ukraine to Europe. In the winter, this can cause a lot of cold and hardship for people across the continent. And how this is going to play out in the next few months is going to be very important, because part of the ability of the Europeans to effectively respond to any Russian territorial movements or any Russian pressures is their ability to do so in the financial and economic arena. But as they're so dependent on Russia for gas, it's very difficult for them to do anything because at the end of the day, they need the Russians' gas. In some countries, it's up to 50% of all their natural gas. In some of the other countries, it's closer to 30.
In my opinion, they command a level of respect commensurate with their power. The number one source of national power for Russia is economic power, and that is in the form of oil and gas. And Putin has used oil and gas as a weapon against the West. He's done it in Ukraine and very recently as well. In the past few years, if they did not toe the line and answer to Moscow, he would just turn off the gas, and he does it at the best possible time, which is in winter. It tended to change the behavior of the Ukrainians very quickly. They also are able to use oil and gas somewhat as a weapon against Poland, Germany, and other Western countries because of their dependency on Russian oil and gas. I'm sure our leaders right now are thinking of ways that we can counter that economic lever that the Russians are so successfully employing. One would be to increase U.S. production of liquefied natural gas and get it to Europe, but that's going to take a long time, and I don't know if the Europeans are willing to endure the pain necessary to teach Vladimir Putin a lesson over what he just did in Crimea.
I was in Ukraine the first week of February 2014. It was basically a tent city, and the protesters with their face masks, because they didn't want to be identified. I mean, they were very afraid that if things didn't go well, that eventually they would be jailed or whatever. Their main frustration is, we elect people, that's great, we have these fair and free elections, but everybody's been corrupt. So they were really protesting for a democracy that will work. It's like they wanted their institutions to function better. And they wanted the corruption to go away and for there to be more accountability. And if you look into what we have found now since Yanukovych left power, it was unbelievably corrupt. He and just a few people stole like $37 billion under very, very elaborate schemes, setting up shell companies and banks and all kinds of people complicit in this, and just, sending the money of the country out to these places and then eventually coming back to them personally. And then meanwhile, other countries in the neighborhood, Poland right next door, their standard of living is 3 times what it was 20 years ago. And the Ukrainians are like, we could be like them. But because our government's been so poorly run, we're not. So it was really a protest to get a government that works. And they saw moving toward the EU was going more in the right direction than going into more with the Russian model, which really is not a democratic model. The reality is they're going to have to kind of stay in between because, again, geopolitics is a big theme of this region, and they are just situated where they are. So they will be dependent on Russia for energy, but the economic way ahead is through the EU and that model. So hopefully there's a way that they can leverage both opportunities.
The Ukrainian president had negotiated a trade agreement with Europe, or the European Union, and the Russian president urged him not to sign it, and the Ukrainian president complied.
Ukraine is split in half. There is a pro-Russian side of Ukraine that's closer to Russia, and then there is a pro-Western Ukraine, which is closer to Poland. One society says we ought to be more like Russians, the other one says, hey, we ought to be more like the West. So the young people in Ukraine saying, we see how the other young people live in other countries. To the right of us, they don't live very well, they haven't advanced too far, and the only reason they have fancy cars and expensive clothing is because of the oil price. And then we see the way the people on the left of us live that have things that are maybe not so materialistic, but they're definitely healthy. There's a medical system, there's fire department, there's police department, there's these things. If they get closer to Europe and they become part of this European Union, then they have to play by rules. Then there are going to be observers during the elections. There's going to be more control over the government. And they would have to be more transparent. If they go closer with Russia, then the opposition is going to be in prison. So young people decided that they rather have more organization that would criticize the government and not end up in prison.